Good morning. I'm Margie O'Driscoll, and on behalf of the Center for Innovation's Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. The mission of the center is to reshape the architecture, engineering, and construction industry for a better tomorrow. So thank you for being with us on this journey. We'd also like to take a moment to express our gratitude to the many sponsors who make our work possible. Thank you. The Center for Innovation recently concluded our fall forum, which included talks with people charged with rebuilding the Ukraine, the Bosch innovation story, and a deep dive into several building owners' perspectives about the view of innovation in 2050. If you missed any of these webinars, please check out all our past webinars on our YouTube channel. Today, we're so excited. We'll be discussing design to value with two leaders from Bryden Wood. Now operating from 8 offices worldwide, Bryden Wood has become widely known as a global disruptor for pioneering new approaches in the design and construction sector that seek to transform how value is generated, enhanced, and retained in the built environment. Using the combined powers of data, construction technology, and imagination to establish the most effective solutions for complex buildings, Bryden Wood has led major design and construction projects in aviation, healthcare, education, residential, water infrastructure, and transportation infrastructure. The firm has just ventured across the pond and is opening an office here in the United States. We think we have a lot to learn here in the United States about their approach, so we're delighted to have these two leaders join us in conversation. Today, they will discuss the company's innovation story and their design to value philosophy. Seeking to create deep and lasting impacts on industry, society, and the planet, design to value rejects the industry's current professional services model. Jaimie and John will draw on their decades of experience, share successes and learnings through pivotal projects and client relationships, and map out a new dynamic route to industrialized construction. Here's a little bit of background about both of our speakers. Jaimie leads the application of systems to the delivery and operation of high-performing assets at Bryden Wood. He's an authority on the platform's approach to design for manufacture and assembly and works on a new data-led digital workflows for government and private sector clients around the world. He's the author of a benchmark strategic document on platforms that is now the foundation for the British government's drive to create a more productive, value-driven construction sector. In 2021, he was awarded an MBE for services to construction. Jaimie is joined by Professor John Dyson. John spent more than 25 years at GlaxoSmithKline, ending his time there as Vice President, Head of Capital Strategy and Design, where he focused on developing a long-term strategic approach to asset management. He then went to work for Bryden Wood. Together with Bryden Wood, he developed the Front End Factory, a collaborative endeavor to explore how to turn purpose and strategy into the right projects, which paved the way for design to value. John is also a professor of human enterprise at the University of Birmingham, focusing on project management, business strategy, and collaboration. Welcome, Jaimie. Welcome, John. Jaimie, I think you're going to get us started.
Thank you very so much for that fantastic intro, Margie. And it's a real pleasure to be here and share some of our experiences and our journey in the hope that it's useful to people watching or listening. So, yeah, perfect. Okay, so we're going to not bore you with endless slides. I want to show a few slides just to frame the journey that John and I have been on. And then we'll probably pause and talk about the that term Margie just used, the front end factory, and that was the sort of evolution of some of this thinking. And then we might show you the sort of application of it in a more sort of formalized way, and then sort of talk plenty about some of the case studies and things. So hopefully it's interesting, and hopefully it prompts some questions from people. So a quick potted history for those who haven't come across us previously. So we started out in 1995. I was actually employee number 1, so I've seen the whole sort of transition we've been through. We started out initially as a firm of architects, but we always had an interest in how to get all the benefits of manufacturing, so productivity and quality and safety and cost reduction into construction. So we started developing sort of industrialized construction solutions probably a long time before a lot of our peers, and obviously that's now become one of the real interest and focus of the industry. So we went on this journey where we realized very early on we had to be very integrated. So we quickly moved from being architects to having all of the design disciplines in-house and breaking down the sort of silos that exist between the disciplines. We then went on a strange journey of developing solutions that technically could be built, but the market wasn't particularly excited about delivering. So we started prototyping things ourselves, which is a very unusual thing for a consultant to do. And then we eventually ran our own factory for about 8 years, delivering small schools projects and supermarkets. So we don't have the factory anymore, but we do have a prototyping facility. So one part of our journey was going very deep into industrialized construction, running a factory, really understanding what that means. And we were delivering and continue to deliver sort of 20-30% capital cost savings, 20 to 30% schedule reduction. So one way of looking at it is to go, well, that's fantastic, mission accomplished. We were kind of doing what we set out to do. But we started to pick up signals from either clients that were the recipients of the more traditional design process and were saying that I got a building that photographed beautifully, but was an operational nightmare to run. Or we started saying to clients, yes, say I save you 30% capital cost. That might be fantastic, but if it's, say, the wrong hospital in the wrong bit of the country, or it's entirely the wrong facility, then saving a little bit of capital cost isn't helping you. It's sort of tinkering around the edges. So we went on a sort of journey of, we called it swimming upstream. So I'm sure lots of you have seen the McLeamy curve, where it says that your ability to create change is massive at the start of a project at very little cost, and it gets increasingly hard to implement change later in the project and the cost goes up. This is our version of that. So we started saying, well, actually, yeah, if we want to do the systemized construction piece on the right hand side, there's a particular way of designing and rationalizing that needs to happen before that. Then moving left, to do that we probably want to do much more data analysis and simulation, and before that, even on the very left hand side, we really need to start engaging with clients much earlier. So as evidenced by John being here, we tend to work with long-term clients. We tend to form much longer relationships and get the ability over time to start earlier and earlier in a project with them. And we also started saying, what are we optimizing for? So I'm sure you've seen versions of this graph before, or this slide before. So the left-hand side, design is, say, 1 unit of cost, build is, say, 10 units of cost. I think everyone's aware that the kind of operation and maintenance running of a facility costs 3 or 4 times the build cost over the life of a building, but actually staffing cost is much bigger still. The impact on the business is bigger still, and the potential impact on society is vast. So we all benefit from a better built environment. So we started saying, look, we've been focusing too much on the left-hand side of this slide for too long. The whole sort of approach was to say, well, how can we start to use the design process to influence the greatest span of these things to the greatest extent? And that was the kind of starting of this design to value thing, was saying, well, how can we use design and delivery to maximize value, not just necessarily to clients, but even beyond that? So John, do you want to talk about this one? I think this is one of your slides from the early days.
Yeah. So the design to value process, the words design to value came from processes adopted in the product world, the design of products, particularly products that you see on your supermarket shelves. And the whole idea was to really understand what the value of that product was, and stripping away anything that sort of used energy, used resources, but didn't add value, and to come up with the optimum product. So that was the idea. But what we were aware of, even though that was the idea, is that the built environment's quite different to a product that you can hold in your hand, because it has such huge effects, because we live in these things, we live and thrive in the built environment. So we had to start to look sort of more broadly at how we would think about this. And one of the ways we did that is to start to develop ideas about what value was. And these are just areas that we decided to develop, and we use them when we're talking about value with clients and organizations to help make sure that we're taking the widest sort of sweep of value that we can. So classically, people on projects, very capital cost orientated often. And of course, there is financial value that products have, and that's really important. Businesses have got to make returns. Governments have limited amounts of money, so they've got to understand capital costs and the return on capital and cash flow and those things. There's more to it than that, though, because there's all sorts of things about exposure, capital exposure, and end of life, residual value, those sorts of things. So that's an area to explore. But financially is only one area of value that we think about. Companies and classically architects are interested in some of these things about impression and aesthetics. But once again, it's deeper than that. So if you go into the built environment and it works and feels good and flows well and isn't just efficient monetarily, but is efficient for people using it, efficient use of time and expertise, those things are really important as well. So how might you go about doing those things? And then there's social value. So of course, the impact on the environment, which is becoming more and more important. Things like democratization. So how do you spread economic benefit or accessibility for something like medicines, accessibility to medicines, providing for social needs, and how do you make things accessible and inclusive in your build? And then finally, an area that's often missed but think's really important is the value of doing. So how can you add value in the process of designing and delivering your asset? And that can be through developing individuals, through moving on their capability, giving them insight and learning, creating opportunities to do new things. And I was struck once, I was sat by the side of somebody at dinner one night, and they were talking about, actually, I think it was the third runway at Heathrow. I don't know where that is now, but they were talking about the third runway at Heathrow Airport in London. And they were saying, you know, we're trying our best to minimize the impact on the local environment, because of course they have to close roads and they've got lots of logistics, and that impacts people who live there. And my response, and it's sort of a value design to value response, is how could you do the opposite of that? How could you use the way that you delivered the product to enhance the experience of the people who lived around the airport, not just do it? And so how do you create value in the doing of the project is important. I just want to say a few more things about that. So classically on projects, you collect objectives and then you rank objectives and you say these are the most important. But although some of that happens in value statements, we try not to do that too much, because that limits you. It limits your opportunity. And target objectives often limit both upside and downside. If you reach the target, you think, oh, that's enough, I've done that, so that's okay. Whereas our view is maybe you could do better than that. So we try not to over focus on individuals or over prioritize, and we try not to focus on too few. And the other thing to say is that we don't believe the idea that if you want a better capital cost, you have to give up aesthetics, or if you want a better capital cost, you have to reduce accessibility. We don't believe that that's the case. We believe there are probably options and ways of designing something and delivering it which can give you both, which can be additive in the value piece. So we use this really to help us explore the value space, if you like, on projects.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, just building on that. Yeah, we found it interesting actually that constructions typically feels constrained by that time, cost, quality triangle. That you can have one of them at the expense of the two. But as John says, we spend a lot of time with clients using this sort of thing to say, if we could achieve a series of things concurrently, what would we do? What would good look like? If we could deliver it quicker, would you build it quicker? Would you start the capital cost later? Would you, what sort of choices would you make if you knew that you could achieve some of these things? So this is the kind of current, I would say, description of how we go about the process. This is it's a constant work in progress. We'll probably talk about this later. We're not saying that we have a sort of perfect approach that is easily replicable, but this is our sort of current thinking around it. So top left of this diagram, we tend to start now with not with a brief, but with a problem statement. So we used to get a brief from a client that said, I want to achieve, I need a hospital with X number of beds and X number of theatres and X number whatever. We now don't often get a brief. Increasingly, we say, what is the outcome that you want to achieve? And the search space might be quite broad. It might be that you need a new asset. It might be something else is a better solution. So we now don't start with even the assumption that the answer is an asset or a building. We start with an outcome, and we then start to look at how we might use a range of techniques to explore different potential solutions. Out of that, we then do a lot of iteration, and we're typically trying to sort of rationalize and optimize assets as much as possible. Very often, out of the rigor of understanding how to do that, we start to collect rules and patterns that we can then start to use automation. And we'll talk about that next Friday and how we do automated design. Very often the same logic then reveals a kind of kit of parts or industrialized construction solution. Very often then we prototype it and then we sort of deliver these things. So in our heads, there's a range of these tools that come together. So in this talk, we're going to talk about probably the first half of the process. So use of data analytics, a methodology we developed with John called chip thinking, and an increasingly hot topic now for lots of our clients is how to develop a super rationalized, optimized design that can then be configured either for specific sites or particular geographies, so that they can start to really maximize the benefit in a central design and not have to rework things and pay for bespoke design every single time they do a project. Next week we're going to talk about creative technologies and the automated piece and industrialized construction, but we're going to sort of focus on the the process. So if I pause here, John, do you want to talk through this diagram, which was the one that was on the top left of that sort of process? And this is one of the critical I don't know, sort of key steps for us.
Yeah, so I like this slide because it gives a number of the sort of ways in which we have learned to go about design to value. So Jaimie talked about the problem statement, and that's really important, because a problem statement rather than a brief for me does two things. One of them is that it opens up a much bigger space. So as Jaimie alluded to, if you say, actually what I want to do is treat 3,000 patients per year for the next 5 years, that's very different from saying I want a hospital with 200 beds. And it keeps that really wide open to start with. It opens up the widest space for thinking about and innovating what that might look like. So that's really important. The other thing, one thing that I mean, Margie did a fantastic introduction to us, so that was brilliant. One thing I hadn't passed on, but is important to me is I'm a psychotherapeutic counsellor as well, so I'm very interested in human beings, and quite often the way that we set up relationships in business and particularly in construction is sort of parent-child. So the client parent comes along and tells the child what he wants, and then they produce it, and then it's either good or bad, and they're either on the naughty step or they get a sweet or something. Whereas what a problem statement does actually is create the opportunity for real collaborative adult conversations that says, let's share and develop the understanding together of what the problem is, and let's share the understanding of what solutions might be. And we're not magicians. We don't see ourselves as magicians that we can create, the client can create a problem and then we can magic up some solutions. we see it very much as a collaborative effort that we can analyze, we can test ideas, we can innovate ourselves, but together we can both develop the problem and develop the solution. So it invites that sort of relationship. So collaboration becomes a key part of it. It's using our expertise in building and building systems with the expertise of the client in their products and processes and services that they produce, and then understanding that if we're going to do something really special, then there's an area that we can work on to develop together to jointly problem solve. And the way we do that is a classic sort of scientific or problem solving way that having understood the problem to a degree, and that can be itself modified to then come up with some ideas, come up with some hypotheses about what might work or some design ideas. And then using some of the electronic data-driven systems, and we'll talk a little bit more about chip thinking in a moment, we can then try out those ideas digitally and sometimes as prototypes, as mentioned. And then if we do that quite quickly, then we can then analyze and evaluate what we learned. And does that change the problem statement? Does it mean we can do more than we thought or less than we thought? And it gets us learning, and we go around that cycle a number of times, and failing fast in those things we found is very good at finding solutions. The other piece that this brings up is in order to collaborate well, you need to bring people on board with the work you're doing, and that means visualizing things well. So we try very hard to visualize data. Sometimes that's visualizing data given directly to us by clients, but a lot of times it's about data that in the design process, not just creating a 2D drawing and asking someone whether they like it or not, but try to bring it alive. And just for instance, on the top right hand diagram, we've used chips there. We'll talk about chips in a moment, but we've directly color coded the chips to how they impact the cost of goods on a product which was really sensitive to cost of goods. So it allows you to have a much better conversation with the client about the facility and how it drives their cost of goods, which is what was one of their key value drivers on that project. And that's really important in engaging people in the subject. And it also shows on this slide that how you have to move all the time through different levels of a project and be able to work with the client at those levels. So there's an Africa supply chain there, right down to an air handling unit, and in a sense, you have to be able to 1 minute talk about air handling units and their impact on the overall facility and the M&E strategy, the mechanical and electrical strategy, but then the next minute you need to be talking about African supply chains and the problem with importing materials into ports and port capacity, and it's that ability. I think it was Einstein that said that that's a mark of genius. Not that we say we're geniuses, but that's always our aim, is to be able to think at multiple levels at the same time about a project. So this sort of explains to you a lot about the sorts of things that we sort of try to develop to do when we're trying to do design to value.
Yeah, and this cycle happens very, very quickly, as John said. So what we found quite early on is that no one knows the perfect solution day one, but everyone knows a bad idea when they see one. So we often use this sort of try thing to actually put sort of provocative potential solutions out, or things we know that won't work, but you get the reaction, people going, it won't work, and you say, good, tell me why, and you almost definitely learn something every time. But rather than do a sort of piece of design, submit it to a client, wait for their comments, they come back, this happens very, very quickly. I'll stop sharing my screen now. to the extent that we part of the reason that John's here now, we actually moved GlaxoSmithKline people into our office because this speed of iteration and need for collaboration was happening so quickly that we actually gave GlaxoSmithKline free space in the office, created a co-located space, and it invited people to kind of leave their corporate badge at the door. And so it became very hard to tell in some of these sessions who was a Glaxo person, who was a Bryden Wood person, who was a subject matter expert had been brought in. And so we created this sort of space to allow things to happen very quickly. But I think the first one we did actually was in healthcare. We were given a brief for a hospital, and we did some basic modeling on, how to set up the theatre, the procedures, scrub time, time to reset it up. We modeled up a bunch of scenarios and found that we demonstrated or sort of put forward to the client they could do all the things they needed with 5 theatres, not 6. And they went, well, that's quite interesting, because that's a big capital and staff and cost saving. And from that, we then started to develop a sort of visual language to describe their hospital. That what we found is no one could read plans. So when you showed plans to people, you were getting feedback. They didn't really understand what they were looking at. When we turned the hospital into a series of almost flow diagrams or wiring diagrams, suddenly everyone felt comfortable to contribute to those and build them without trying to design the building at the same time. So I think that was some of the early stuff. And then do you want to talk about front end factory and how that started to morph into, a much broader, sort of much wider approach, John?
Yeah, sure. So we, this time I was head of global capital projects, and we delivered projects all over the world. And like many project organizations, our clients weren't always very happy with us. They felt that projects didn't deliver what they really wanted, and they were too expensive. And we had this sort of meeting in a basement in Slough in the south of in England. Not a very salubrious place at all, really. It's quite interesting, although very close to Windsor and Windsor Castle. And we had this meeting where I got some clients along, my clients within the organization, and I got some project people along from different companies. And Martin Wood, one of the co-founders of Bryden Wood, was one of the people in the room. And and I got my clients to talk about what they felt about projects, and they really let spill all their frustrations and so on. And out of that, Martin contacted me and said, well, come in and let's talk about this some more. So we did. We had a few sessions in London where we were just sat really almost scratching our chins and thinking about how we could do it. And we came up with some ideas and started to think about the wider value, and started to think about what we might do. And then a project came into my organization that had gone through the very classic design process. So it was a project for putting a drinks factory in Africa. It had been designed by a classic design consultant, and it had come back. I think the cost was about $100 million in cost, and it didn't make business. The business returns didn't work on it. So the business was upset because it was part of their strategy to grow in Africa, and this seemed too expensive and wasn't going to work. So we thought, well, let's have a go. Let's have a go at seeing what we could do with this. Let's try and do something different. The first thing we did was very much as Jaimie started talking about, which was we tried to say, well, how could we apply some very good, straightforward engineering? How could we simplify the building? How could we make it smaller, make sure it was efficient, that we didn't overuse the space, etc., both at site level and building level, and let's use methods of construction which meant we could deliver it more quickly, which sort of improves the business case. So we did those things, and we did take, I think, nearly about $30,000, $30 million off the thing, but it still didn't work. So we thought, well, that's interesting. So we've done all we can really in the sort of classic value engineering piece, and applying our our knowledge, what else could we do? So we said, why doesn't it work? And they go, well, the margins on the products don't work. Some of the margins are low. So we investigated that. And this is where chips really came in, because we thought, well, in order to investigate that, we have to understand how the marketplace impacts directly or is joined directly to the process that happens in the facility and the facility. So we broke the process down into blocks, and we thought about the equipment and the energy required and everything for those blocks. And then we mapped the cost of goods through those blocks. And that showed us actually that there was a fundamental problem with some of the products that they were looking to build in a new location where energy costs were very high. And that's what was causing the problem. And actually the business ended up not doing it. They ended up not investing in the facility. Now, we think that that's a great outcome some of the time for design to value. We, of course, know that we will be out of a job quite quickly if we did it all the time. But it really showed to us that actually you have to look at different dimensions on different projects, and you have to get under the skin of the client much more to understand value in their eyes. And also it means that some of the solutions that we come up with may be very different from the first solution that was thought about when we came in.
Yeah, and that's again, that's the sort of key thing for us, is this idea that rather than assuming that the answer is a building and proving what the building is, saying, well, is it even a building? Is the business case, does it stack up? Does it make sense? So that was a real it was one of the first times we'd sort of properly done that. But we've talked a couple of times about chips now, actually. So I think I'll show just debating whether to show these, but I think I'll show these. So chip thinking, John and I both mentioned a couple of times. So front end factory was the process then that John led within GlaxoSmithKline, and that started to become almost like the sort of de facto thing that projects went through as part of the business case and analysis process. From that, we started to formalize how we'd done it and sort of write the rule book and start to turn it into a repeatable process, which became very important to us. So as John said, chip thinking at its sort of fundamental is breaking a process or a building down into value adding steps or transformational steps or chunks of a building that always come together. So I often use the healthcare version, like a theatre never exists on its own. It always comes with a clean and dirty core. It has an anaesthetic room, a scrub, prep, some circulation, some staff, some consumables. So a theatre never exists in isolation. It always comes with a cluster of things. And what we found through the sort of front end factory days was that we were working with these very complex organizations. They had lots of different stakeholders who all spoke a slightly different language, who all looked at the business through a slightly different lens, who all had a particular take on any particular topic. But even in an organization like GlaxoSmithKline, there's some very bright people, but no one knows everything that Glaxo knows about any topic. So that became quite interesting to us, that we said, well, if you can break it into a chip, and you can use that then to drag in every bit of expertise and knowledge that everyone in the business has got about a particular topic, it becomes a way of, we described it as aggregating business intelligence. So suddenly you could bring everyone's knowledge, put it into a chip, put a load of chips together, and suddenly you can play back to a client more knowledge on any particular topic than anyone in the business has. So we definitely didn't ever come in saying, we know tons about pharmaceuticals, but luckily you're GlaxoSmithKline, you know lots about pharmaceuticals. What we think we can do is help aggregate that knowledge, visualize it, play it back, and help you to make better informed decisions. So that was the kind of the fundamental thinking. So if I show you, this is sort of at one level a sort of fairly typical chip for us. So typically you'd have a geometrically often not particularly sophisticated model. It's a sort of building block that everyone kind of would recognize as the room. Sometimes it's literally just a bounding box that says piece of equipment. What sits behind it, though, is that kind of data set of everything we can glean from the client and every person that we can come into contact with. What it means is you can then plug these things together very, very quickly. So either to model an existing facility or model a potential new facility, whether that's a pharma facility, hospital, data center, whatever it is. We use these to very quickly generate a sort of working model that we can then start to test things against. So we've now got probably thousands of these for Glaxo. We've got libraries of them for healthcare, for data centers, for other clients. We're starting to sort of build up our chip libraries. But what it means is we can then very quickly build a model and sort of test things. So this diagram is describing 3 drugs being made or consumables being made. So goods come in, they get stored, they get processed, they get stored, they go out the door. So you can imagine at this sort of level, it's incredibly quick to test this and say, what happens if we have more storage but fewer vehicle movements, or vice versa? What happens if we add a line or remove a line? What happens if we drop a chip in that does this? So we often use this firstly to test endless iterations very, very quickly, or to sort of, some of these will be chips that we absolutely know how they work. Some of them can be hypothetical chips that we'll drop in and say, if you had a chip that did this, this would be the impact. We need this chip, so let's go and talk to GE or someone to see if they can make us a piece of equipment. So at this level, it becomes really quick to test ideas and get some data outputs, as John says, sort of simulate things quite early. But we'll do it at individual process level. Sometimes we'll do it at facility level to say, here's the kind of optimized process flow. Here's actually what happens on a site or across a campus. You can see where the bottlenecks are, so it starts to reveal something at kind of campus level. John mentioned earlier a kind of Africa scale level, looking at how to tackle the African market. So we do it at a range of scales. Sometimes we do things like this. This was a study to, I think the problem statement was, I think there was a potential need for a new facility. And one of the things we did was just go into all the rooms and measure their usage and utilization and start to look for opportunities to, say, make underutilized rooms multifunction, or start to share rooms between departments, or start to find ways that you could not have to build a new facility, but just increase the utilization of the existing facility. So again, that's another sort of good use case. But as John said earlier, we then tend to get, what we realize is no one reads reports particularly, but if you can boil things down to a handful of graphics, so either the flow charts that described a hospital I mentioned earlier, we very often try and generate these sorts of graphics, which are super visual, tell you something quite important. And you can see here, for instance, the color fading as we go into the future. So we're saying the data is quite good for up to 2017, a little bit less good for 2019. It's a total guess by the time we get to 24. So we're trying to convey the quality of information, the level of certainty. And again, not say to people, we know the answer, but we know within a range, this is looking like a sensible way forward. This was from one of the earlier things. So because every chip knows how much air and water and utilities it uses, for instance, as quickly as you're assembling, say, your process chips or your room chips, it's totting those up and working out how much power you'll need and how much water and how much air. So it's also starting to kind of self-generate potentially utilities, and all the mechanical electrical systems are getting generated off the back of putting the chips together. So it starts to then self-design some of these primary systems, which means we can often then start to predict running costs. So bear in mind, we're nowhere near designing a facility at this point. We can have sometimes a pretty good idea how much it would cost to run the facility, and then we can start to look at predictions of energy costs and say, well, how do you start to choose your primary plant? Is it better to be air-cooled or water-cooled, depending on the cost of these things? And as John said, that was critical in one of the early stages of this to kill a project, by saying, well, actually, it's the utilities cost that doesn't stack up. You can't fix that through design, and so the project shouldn't persist. I mentioned right at the start, we'll typically try and put staffing costs into these things as well. So again, as you're generating your early chip models, you're also predicting your running cost and staffing cost. And again, that's things we've seen in projects where, mentioned earlier, the building looks beautiful, but it costs a fortune to run because they're having to have operational policies and lots of staff to manage the asset. So if you can tackle this early on, that has a huge potential impact on the viability of certain projects.
I was just going to say one thing on that slide, just to quickly say, is the quality mark, data quality mark. So one of the things we're very aware of early in projects is that the amount of data or the quality of it is very varied depending on, some things are just guesses. And what we very much try and do is make sure that people are aware of that. Because otherwise people take all the information to be of the same quality and make decisions about it. So that Will Redmond read means that that's just a guess at the moment as a piece of information. It needs to be validated, but it's a starting point to start to think about it. And it would go green when we're much more certain about that information. So the visual markers like that we find very useful to have better conversations.
Mm. And also, so that came around because we were having, we're going to ask a subject matter expert 15 questions. 14 of them they would answer because they knew exactly what the answer was. One of them they didn't know, so they guessed, but they wouldn't tell us they were guessing because they didn't want to say, I've no idea, no one's ever asked me that question. And then we'd run the analysis and you get some crazy results. And when you did the sensitivity analysis, you'd find there was one piece of data which was super critical and say, oh yeah, I've got no idea whether that's true or not. So we started saying to people, it's okay to guess as long as we know you're guessing, and then we'll tell you whether that's important. So some things you could be out by a factor of 10, makes no difference. Some things are super critical. So that thing we should do, spend some time and effort to get better data or test more things. It starts to tell us where to put our effort. Yes, that's a sort of summary of all the sorts of things that will typically come out of a report. We'll be looking at not just a single phase typically of a facility, but multiple phases and an expansion strategy and how it might change over time. We'll be looking at obviously running costs and utilities costs, staff costs, and increasingly this is a sort of precursor then to the industrialized construction, the sorts of kits of parts that we might start to use. So this is the last slide and then we'll chat a bit more, but these are the sorts of benefits that we're seeing. So faster option appraisal because we can test and analyze these things much quicker. Joint decision making because of that thing of it being very clear who's contributed information, what information they've contributed, and the transparency of people being able to see how their information influences others. So one of the first healthcare projects we did, I remember going back to the security person and say, look, we didn't manage to meet your security brief or give you all the things you wanted from a security point because we thought daylight for patients was more important, and so we've prioritized daylight, but it does mean that this visual access doesn't work. Do you agree that was a good idea? And even the security guys going, yeah, I think in the balance of things that's probably a better thing to do. So we often broker these conversations where one stakeholder can see why they're not getting their preferred thing, but it's for the greater good, but they've contributed to that and they feel involved. Leaner contingencies on the right, that's the sort of color coding and seeing where the risks potentially lie. And then, yeah, underneath that, we then get into better procurement, more agile solutions, overall better decision making. So I'll stop sharing the slides there. Do you want to talk about some of the, I was going to talk about the prisons program in a bit, but I don't know if there's any sort of particular sort of key moments in the chip thinking or key projects we've worked on that you think are worth sort of elaborating a little bit on.
I think I would just notice the time, and there's only got about 15 minutes, so we want to leave time for some questions. But I think the prison one is a really good example because of that range of value that you're looking for, and why really it wasn't about building a prison, it was about something else. So I think it's worth talking about that.
Yeah, okay. So this was we were so I think there's something really interesting actually that so John had seen like a really early version of this that we'd done in healthcare, and we started doing it for GlaxoSmithKline. The Ministry of Justice, who we were working with, were watching what we did with GlaxoSmithKline and going, well, that's quite interesting. What's our version of that process? So they came to us in 2016 and asked us to design a new type of prison. So this was for the prisons program in the UK. It's about 10,000 places, 1.2 billion pounds. They said, can you design a new type of prison that would tackle reoffending rates? So saying the cost of reoffending, people come out of prison, can't find work, fall back into their old ways, go back to prison. That costs in the UK, it's about 12-13 billion pounds a year. So that's on the very, right-hand side of our bubble diagram. They were saying, forget the £1 billion construction cost. If you could tackle reoffending rates, you could have a massive impact. So we had never designed prisons, and I thought that was really interesting that MOJ said that's kind of why we're talking to you, because we know that if we go to a sort of one of the incumbents, they've got so much knowledge they won't be able to unthink what they know about prisons. Because we came in with a completely blank sheet of paper and did exactly that kind of analysis testing process, we put out some potential ideas that were very, very far reaching that we knew MOJ would never go for, but it made some of the things we did do seem much more palatable. But over a course of sort of 18 months, we spoke to endless prisoners, prison support groups, governors, senior staff, the kind of CNR staff who tackle riots and things in prison. So it was the biggest piece of research, as far as we know, that anyone's ever done into kind of prison cohorts. We looked at different models of incarceration abroad, and we've ended up with a completely different type of prison. So we got rid of bars in windows, for instance, which everyone said you'll never get rid of the bars because it's one of the kind of archetypal things of prisons. We were told very early on, you'll have seen in every prison film the sort of gallery where there's like 2 floors and a little sort of corridor atrium. We were told day one we would never get rid of that because it allows prison staff to see each other. They can read the temperature of the room, they can understand what's going on, saying that's one of the fundamental things of prisons. You'll never get rid of that. And we said, I wonder if that's true. Maybe just no one's ever tried something different. So we actually used VR. We put prisoner staff into a whole range of different operation environments and said, what happens if I make it wider or taller? What happens if your colleague's over there? So we broke down their preconceptions of a typical block in a prison, and we got them from in UK prisons. It used to be you would be, say, 1 in 80 prisoners on a floor over 2 floors, so you're sort of 1 in 160. All the evidence says that a cohort of 1 in 12 is the best kind of size. If you're with 4 people who fall out with 1, that's a problem. If you're in 160, that's quite dehumanizing. And so we managed to get them through a design process to blocks of 20, which is much closer to the kind of evidence that says, you're going to get rehabilitation. It was a much more then normalizing environment. It was, bars on windows, self-ventilation things. So we completely transformed the design of the prisons, and that is now the de facto design that's being rolled out across a series of 5-6 prisons in the UK. And it's been incredibly successful implementation. So it's my favorite case study. It's the one that probably has the biggest potential societal impact. And I love the fact it was public sector saying, yeah, we can see the benefit of this approach. Have a go at prison.
And what I loved was, I was remembering, I was a little bit involved in the project, but I remember being in meeting rooms next door where there were those prison guards using VR units which simulate the process, the prison, and so on, so that they could give direct feedback and things like that. I mean, they're not gimmicks. They're about, if it's really important that prison guards can operate in this area, how do we engage them in the process early on and make sure that we understand what it is that they need and want to be able to do their job, as well as understanding what the inmates and families need in order to, help rehabilitate and bring them into society, and then understand what the prison service needs in order to make sure it's secure and all those things. All these things like VR are about engaging people in the process.
Yeah, I remember the final stage of that design process. We weren't presenting the design; it was MOJ presenting it back to themselves and saying, "So here's how the control and restraint strategy works. Here's how the education thing works. Here's how the visits will work in future. Here's how we provide in-cell services." So that became, again, that sort of joint accountability that they were kind of reinforcing for themselves why it was a good idea. And as I say, they're rolling out lots of these blocks now. Anyway, I noticed we've got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to stop there. I haven't seen any questions in the chat, Margie, but I don't know if you want to chip in, or whether anyone's got any questions, by all means, put them in the chat.
Yes. Mark Belis, Mark, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, asks, can you speak about how this approach has been applied to housing, which may be more sensitive to code requirements that constrain the design space?
We keep trying to get into residential, and we keep being resisted, is probably a good way of saying it. It does feel like it's quite a what's a good way of saying it? So we've roamed between sectors quite a lot. As I say, we get invited into places like prisons where we haven't ever designed a prison specifically, because we do these sort of interesting things, and we've done lots of aviation, pharmaceuticals, data centers. We tend to work in the kind of potentially more sort of complex units. We keep saying to people, actually, the fact that they're sort of process type buildings, that's not why this works. It would work somewhere else if we're allowed to do it. I suspect there's some really interesting stuff we could do around community engagement, for instance, and getting people engaged in the design process. We'll talk a bit about that next week with Maria. But yeah, there seems to be a reluctance from residential to engage with this. I don't know why that is. I think it's because people who are kind of specialists in housing understand, it's also got a myriad sensitivities. People who work in that sector tend to focus very much on that sector and don't seem to sort of invite us in. But I don't know, John, whether you've got any comments on that, because we've tried to get in housing for years.
We've been involved in bits and pieces, but it does seem a struggle. I do wonder, and that certainly the residential sector in the UK is very much there's much less supply than there is demand, and therefore the need for value is not that great. Whereas other industries, there's an absolute need to be stepping forward and building more value into what they're doing. If you take data centers, for instance, where there's such a huge requirement for them, and they can't get built fast enough, and people are trying to take a step above the other people in the marketplace to get it, so they need to be quicker and more energy efficient. Whereas I don't feel there's that pull. I mean, people want to build more houses, but that doesn't seem to be happening so much. So there's something wrong with the marketplace. I think that's what it feels like. Yeah.
Yeah, here in the Bay Area, there's a lot of community resistance sometimes to building, building certain types of housing. So that ends up being an obstacle that is varied and different and complicated depending on who your community is. I don't know if it's the same in the UK, but certainly
I was going to say as well, one of the things that you notice is that people love brick in the UK. So if you start to suggest anything other than brick, a large part of the population doesn't like it. It seems like if a house in the UK is not made of brick, it's not a proper house. And of course, that has its own restrictions as well in innovation. So,
yeah, it's complicated. We have a question here from Zigru Bell, who's a center board member. Have you an experience where you've used this approach for multiple projects for the same client? Were there benefits or aha moments?
So Glaxo is probably the one we've done the most projects with. I would say we've done that. They've probably had the most varied experience of it. So I'll let John sort of pick that one up. We've done quite a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting because although we've done lots of work for Glaxo and other people, every project's different because you use different set of stakeholders and so on. I remember one project which was to build a factory very quickly for the production of an HIV drug, a life-saving HIV drug, and we had to get it to market as quickly as possible. And it was a factory in Italy, and the site director, when he heard that we might be involved in this, was very dismissive. His view was, well, this is just going to slow it down. Some people in London, getting involved in a project in Parma, in Italy, that's just going to slow things down. This can't be right. We continued with it, and actually at the end of the project, he wrote a letter to us and said, I was wrong, and it was brilliant. And all we did really on that piece is to really understand what was required. And what we did, and I was talking to another client today about it, is what we did is redesign the design process. I mean, we did some clever things in some systemization and so on. But what we basically did was say, if you want to move that quickly, but want something that meets your quality requirements, but also matches the fact that you're still developing the product, so there's variability and change, it's not going to be solid, then we've got to redesign your design process. And they let us do that. And in redesigning the design process, the building was built incredibly quickly, and the product was launched, and it did all the things that it wanted to do, and it happened to win an award. But that was a real aha moment for that person, really, to understand that actually the design processes that we adopt, if you want to do something different, you can't just follow that approach. You have to change the way that you work.
I'd say so Circle Health, the other one we've worked with for years now on private healthcare projects in the UK. I think one of the things, I remember having a conversation with one of their key staff at the time, and I remember talking about, we'd tried loads of different things on the project, and we'd sort of said some of them are things we've done before, some of them are new things, actually some of them haven't gone particularly well, we've got to hold our hands up, we tried this thing, it wasn't a great idea actually. But I remember him saying, but I can see the direction of travel, the trajectory is good. So yeah, within that there's things that went well and things that didn't work out, but the overarching direction of travel is working, and we will continue to go on this journey. And I remember we had a list of like 30, 40 things that we might do on facilities, and we picked the top 5 and tried those ideas out, and then said, well, actually, if we can keep going on this, we'll try the next ones and the next one. So that, I remember they were very we came in after they built their first facility in Circle. Reading was our first healthcare project. That was very successful. We still take people to Circle Reading as a sort of example of the process in action. But actually, I quite like the fact that we almost became sort of not quite a department within Circle, but we actually became, a key part of their decision-making process early on. So actually, they, having done it once, went, right, we should, make sure we sort of do this stuff. And so Birmingham, we've handed over recently. That was about, I think, 30% cheaper per clinical outcome than traditional billed healthcare, and again because they went through this process. Actually, John's not the only sort of ex-client who's joined us. One of the people from Circle Health has also joined and became our sort of one of our key data center people. So that's, maybe that's not coincidence that the two people we've done it most with have enjoyed it so much they've gone, I'd like to continue doing this with other clients. And that's been massively powerful for us, having someone who can talk with John's authority as a client to other clients and say, I've been on this journey, I've been through this process. So I think that, getting clients to be advocates maybe has been an aha moment for us, because we realize that clients can talk differently to clients than designers can, trying to convince them to do something.
I was just, the only other thing I was going to just add there was, quickly, was you said we brought people into the office. That just wasn't construction engineering people. We had finance people and people from strategy and R&D come into the office as well, because this is about, and often we felt like we're a bit of a dating agency, and people who didn't talk to one another in the company, we brought them together and got them to talk and work things out together. So it is, and that's a big aha moment for people, that you can't design these things in a vacuum of the business if you want the value that you're to come out the other end.
So thank you both so very much. We have one quick question, which is, tell us the status of opening an office here in the United States.
Yes, so it's in Boston. We've found an office. I think we've signed the paperwork now. It's taken a while because they're doing the paperwork, getting it in order was more painful. So we're spending more and more time out there now. So between myself and one of my colleagues who heads up the creative technology. So next week, we're going to talk about creative tech and automated design, industrialized construction. Those are the sort of two key things that we'll be doing in the US. So between myself and the guy who heads up creative tech, we're spending more and more time out in the US there. So the reason being that we can it feels like the sort of gravitational pull of these sort of, clients that want to do more of this stuff, general contractors that want to increase their value offer, manufacturers that want to move up the value chain. We're sort of feeling more and more of that sort of coming from North America. So that's why we're spending more time US and Canada. So yeah, we're live and up and running, and we'll be spending more and more time there. So if anyone's interested to hear more, then obviously please reach out.
Jaimie and John, thank you so much for your time this morning. What a terrific presentation. Thank you so much. This concludes the Center for Innovation's event. Please join us next week on November 4th for a second and final part of this series. And it's going to be a conversation, as Jaimie said, with he and Maria Mamura, one of his colleagues. In this webinar, they will discuss the manifestation of design to value as industrialized construction, giving examples of recent innovations and projects discussing the potential for wider adoption. They will draw on the platform's approach used for the first time in a recent project in London and examples of creative technology solutions that are being applied globally in transport infrastructure and the data center sector. They'll describe and illustrate how warp speed progress in rapid engineering modeling, digital configurators, and reference design is irreversibly changing architecture, engineering, and construction. And they're going to offer some ways that companies can avoid being left behind. You're not going to want to miss this session. As a final note to our audience, this recording will be placed on YouTube soon, and we invite you to share it with your colleagues. Thank you again to Jaimie and John for a terrific presentation, for our sponsors who make all this possible, and for you, our community of innovators who do all you can to transform our industry. We'll see you soon.